In doing the Soil Sense podcast, a question I often ask the guests are, what's next? You know, you've already, let's say, started with cover crops as an example, or reduced tillage as an example, but what do you see as coming next? And the most common response I get is, I'd really like to find a way to bring livestock back onto the soil. Now, maybe that's somebody else's livestock that I'm partnering on, or maybe that's, you know, having some livestock for myself, but I'm really trying to figure out this whole livestock component. Let's start here with our panel, starting with Jerry. Jerry, as a rancher on our panel, would love to hear more about the cover crop program. That was such a great video about your operation. Let's hear more specifically about kind of how you integrate cover crops there.
Oh, sure. It's great to be here. I hope you can hear me good. I'm somewhat.
You sound great, Jerry.
You know, I've done enough of these things. It seems like I'm still green. So I appreciate the opportunity to visit with folks. The cover crops have been a big deal for us, and our operation is obviously utilizing the cropland, but then bringing livestock on the land. You know, people ask me all the time, can I build soil health without livestock? And I say, yeah, sure you can, but you'll get there 10 times faster with livestock. I mentioned it in the video, but our three goals are paramount to our operation: trying to get rid of those winter feed costs, or at least cut them back, and then taking depleted soils that, you know, when I was growing up, it was wheat and summer fallow, and half of it's in South Dakota because that's where it blew to back in those days. And I didn't know if we could bring those soils back. They're marginal soils that maybe shouldn't have been broke up, but they were. And we've been really impressed at how we are bringing those back. And then the other big thing, and it really sells to the public. Obviously, we have a venture on the ranch here that incorporates the wildlife, but that's something we can sell to the public. If you know, we just love wildlife, or if you're utilizing it for an income source. So those three goals, and all about regeneration. I never liked the word sustainability, because why would I want to sustain something that's been degraded? I want to regenerate it. And then I want to tell the story to the public of how we are doing that in agriculture, and how we can help, you know, with the issues of our natural resources that so many people are concerned with.
Yeah, and I know in the video it talked about the rotational grazing you're doing as one aspect of that regeneration. What about on the crop side? Are you selecting crops specifically for soil health?
Well, we sure are, and we really try to have all four crop types in our rotation, and we try to do that. But then we're using 22 different species in our cover crop mix, which are part of our rotation, from everything from 2 or 3 kinds of millets to your brassicas, to some BMR grazing, corn, BMR, Sudan sorghum cross. And then a couple of the keys for winter grazing that I really like are collards, because they're like a cabbage plant without the head, and they stay green and leafy even in really cold weather. And if we get some snow on top of them, those cattle will graze through that snow, or dig through the snow, and they'll get that good material. And then the millets are really good for the winter grazing as well. So we really try to make that into a good rotation. We've really seen our biology go just like this as we test for our biology every year. And so, you know, not to get real scientific, I'm a producer, but what excites me about it is you see it going in the right direction. We see the organic matter improving. We see you saw it in some of your programs that I was watching earlier, the granulated soil. I was told by some of the soil specialists, because we have fairly sandy land, that it would be really hard to bring worms back because it's abrasive. And when we pull those soil samples out, they're covered in worms. And so, you know, I some days think I'm getting a little weird that I get excited about a soil sample with worms all over, but it does make me feel like we're going in the right direction.
Oh, I think you're in really good company here with getting excited about worms in the soil, for sure. Well, Kevin, let's go to you here a little bit. When we have a lot of folks in the audience that are already doing row crop farming and wondering if they should think about incorporating livestock in the soil. So maybe just from a basic level, if you could talk about, the benefits of trying to incorporate livestock, or what data we have about the benefits of livestock on these cropping systems.
Well, I'm a big fan of livestock on these cropping systems. For one, it adds a new biology that much of these crop grounds have never seen or haven't seen for decades. And so just the idea of the hoof action and the urine and the manure that creates this different micro population that adds a new value and a new component that then benefits your soil microbial population, which then helps you break down and create more organic matter in time. So livestock to me is one of those tools that, in my opinion, has been a no-brainer to add. It's a quick way to add economic return on that land base. I tell producers, if you're gonna go into cover crops, you don't do it for 1 year or 2 years. You go into long-term, if not forever. The livestock side of it brings you in an economic return quicker than if you're just doing cover crops on a cropping system by themselves. And so that's been my view, is you can look at a way to feed a cow, make some return from that investment on that land, and get the soil benefits as well in the long term.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. And Miranda, assuming someone is convinced by points like Kevin just made, I know you and I have talked about stocking rate and stocking density. In other words, how many head of cattle are we needing out there? Can you just talk about maybe some of the variables that go into that, of how to make that decision about how many cattle are right for my particular field?
Great question, and that is one we get all the time. And so when we are looking at that, we're actually setting carrying capacity. Stocking rate is going to be a function of how many animals you have out there, the type of animals, and usually, obviously, we have beef cattle, but then the demands of those beef cattle. So that's based off of the size of them. And then we don't have it calculated in there. We just adjust accordingly. And so we wing it too in research, not just ranchers. But depending on what stage of production that animal is in, and then the length of period of time that you're going to be grazing them. So when we look at the cover crop end of it, and how do we determine what we're putting out there, usually a person, when we're working with them, they have that set up, they know what animals are going to put out there. So we just adjust the time period to match what we have out there for forage production and what they want out to leave behind for residue. And so unfortunately, there's not any real amazing tools to do this. We have to do it the old way yet. So that's going out, we're clipping, drying that down, and because we want to know what the dry matter is of that, because there's so much variability. I'm sure you've heard this in other discussions today, in the water content of those different species, from your brassicas having up to 80% of them being water versus some of your warm season grasses and cool season grasses. So depending on what you have out there, it's going to influence that dry matter available forage. And so using that, we're going to take what we have for available forage out there, take it times how many acres you have, and then times what we want to leave behind. And so I talked about that harvest efficiency utilization rate. Right now we're looking at take half, leave half, and then a full use. So it's just that 50% use. Hopefully we'll be able to, from this research, be able to provide a little bit more guidance of what that looks like and how that impacts soil health, because we do get a lot of those questions and we don't know for sure. There's preliminary research that Kevin and a graduate student of his, Aaron Gogler, who's actually on this project as well as a PhD student, conducted, and they found that there wasn't a difference between those utilization rates. So we'll see if what we find similar results. And then we're going to divide that by how much that animal needs to support itself for 1 month. And in a cover crop system, we use 1,220 pounds per month versus what we would use in a rangeland grazing system, which is 913. And then we're going to compare that to what we have for stocking rate and set days accordingly. So that's a lot of math. Our extension agents can help you. Give Kevin and I a call. We'll help you through it too. Your NRCS staff, there's lots of people that are willing to help you through that. If you don't want to go through all that, monitor frequently. Go out there, look at those cows frequently, and when they reach that point of residue that you're comfortable with or what you want to leave behind, move them off or move them to the next cell.
And Miranda, we've got a question from the audience that I'll just ask to see if maybe you have any experience with it, but it says, is there research on using UAV imagery? So I guess that's drone imagery to predict biomass and assist a farmer in calculating paddock size and when to move stock during high intensity grazing?
I am not aware of any of that for cover crop systems. I know some rangeland work has been done on that in other states. One thing Kevin and I are chatting about and hoping to get off the ground in the near future is some research working on growth curves of those different species in a forage setting, and so that we can use that to better inform and make these decisions.
Well, moving on to Mary here. Mary, I'm not going to ask you whether a producer should go compost or manure, because I know you're going to tell me it depends. But maybe you could just instead tell us kind of what factors might go into that decision of compost versus manure.
So it's really going to depend. And I used to hate when people told me this, and it's really probably taken me until last year when I was like, oh, I say that a lot too. What's your goal? So what's your plan or what's your goal and what do you hope to get to, and what kind of management and strategies are you willing to put into that system? And so if you are a livestock producer, you're wanting to use your manure differently, you have a front end loader or an SCD, NRCS that has a turner available to you, maybe composting is something you want to look at. But if you're a livestock guy and you're like, I have no time, I barely have time to spread the manure, maybe you're going to hire a local manure hauler and they're going to haul for you and spread for you. And so in that instance, you're using manure. On the cropping side of things, if you're looking at, I want a consistent product, I want something that this is very new to me, I've never used manure before, I'm going to probably point you toward compost. I really want you to try that compost first. But there are also soil health specialists here, even at NDSU, that would argue with me and say, you know, depending on what they're planting or what their goals are for their soil health, manure might be better actually. And so a lot of it is, what is the long-term result you're looking for?
Great, thank you very much. Well, we have another audience question here, so take it back to Jerry for this one. The question is, how late into winter do you shoot for grazing your cover crops, and what speed bumps may keep you from hitting that target?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, we got to remember where we live. Mother Nature will slap you around. You know, we can have all the greatest plans. You know, our goal is, ideally, we'd never feed a bale of hay to a cow, but we also realize where we are, and that doesn't work very many times. Although we've done it several times when, you know, this year is starting out to be pretty good. Our goal, we haven't went on our cover crops yet this year because we've got a fair amount of corn stover and things that were, and some native range that we actually kept for grazing. So it depends. Sometimes we'll have to go to them in November sometime, but I kind of try to shoot to at least get into December. And then depending on how it goes, I'll graze as long. Our cover crops aren't as good this year. We had a pretty serious drought here. And so our cover crops are probably half of normal. So I know they're not going to last as long. The one thing I would like to say, though, we never bring those cows into a corral and feed anymore. We keep them on the land, and that's all about building soil health. So if we have to supplement them, hay or whatever, we take it out there. And we've built some hay yards out, and we've got portable windbreaks. We've got some really good tree groves. And so we've got winter protection out there on the land, and then the hay is out there. And so we're putting that manure and urine into the soil, and it's really made a big difference in our soil health here. So my goal is to wait to go on the cover crops as long as I can. And then depending on the weather, or even if we say we have to, say Mother Nature just slaps us around there in January and February, and we've had that to where we've grazed through some really heavy snow, and the cows, once they get used to this, they'll dig down. But, you know, if you're getting, I remember a couple of years ago, we got 75 inches of snow in like 3 weeks, and it was 20, 30 below. we had to quit. But we kept them out there, we fed them out there, and then we went back on those cover crops come spring and utilized them then. So, kind of like Miranda, she's saying you have to use your head a little bit, think it through. There's no textbook for these things, but use some common sense. And we also try to leave 50% of those cover crops to build soil health. That's a big point. And for cow guys that are used to baling up everything or grazing it all off, sometimes you have to slap yourself to make sure you leave something to feed the soil.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that, Jerry. We have another question from the audience I'm going to direct to Kevin, which is, are there lasting impacts? The question specifically about rotational grazing, but I'm going to say livestock in general. Are there lasting impacts for soil health on livestock, or is this something you got to kind of continue with year after year after year?
I mean, that's a tough question. And obviously with the livestock grazing, in a perennial setting like rangeland, there's obviously lasting impacts, especially if you grow into it, we have a really healthy system that will last a long time. What the problem is we forget is you can wreck it faster than you can fix it. So it'll last as long as you keep that management strategies in place to enhance your soil health. On crop ground, it's the same way, I think, and we don't really know the answer. If I grazed a cover crop for 2 or 3 years and went back and do a cropping system, how long will that benefit last? And it comes down to how did you manage your crop system as well? Did you go to a no-till or a minimum till to maintain those soil health benefits? Or did you bring in tillage and you basically wrecked it the first year? And so it comes down to your overall management of that system in time versus a short-term or a 1 or 2 year benefit from the grazing. It's a long-term benefit that you're looking for, and it takes a long-term management strategies to keep that in place.
Miranda, if we're going to be trying to bring livestock onto the land, how does that change what our considerations need to be for the types of cover crops we plant, or the way we approach our system from day one, where we're trying to optimize for not just for a crop, but also for cattle?
Great question. I know several of you probably joined Kevin for his discussion group. He kind of talked about that species selection piece. And so the first thing is, how does it fit into your entire system? What does it look like for you? What resources do you have? Because we want to make sure whatever you're doing is going to work for you and is feasible, not overwhelming. So starting small is always a good idea. But we have a really good publication that guides you through that. What are your goals? When do you want to utilize that cover crop for grazing? Are you spring grazing? Are you going to do a full season cover crop that you're going to hay and graze, or just hay? Are you going to fall graze? And so based on those scenarios, that publication steps you through how do we select the appropriate species for that. Typically, unless you're spring grazing where you're really restricted to that winter cereal, we want some type of mixture to help increase nutritional quality and maintain that nutritional plane for those livestock grazing that cover crop. The other thing that I think is also, what infrastructure do you have in place and what do you need to get in place to be able to do this on your operations? That's one of the biggest roadblocks we hear from folks, especially when it comes to developing waters and getting fences in place.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And in general, are we often talking about permanent fencing, or is temporary fencing usually pretty adequate?
It depends on what works for you. What are your cows used to? I like to have some type of permanent or at least multi-electric for a perimeter, or recommend just for safety, especially if your animals aren't used to electric fences. But I know Jerry doesn't use, he uses a lot of single wire electric fence, I do believe. And a lot of the other folks that have been doing this for a long time, that's what works for them. Their cows are used to that fence. And so it really comes down to that. And also, what kind of animals are you grazing? Heifers are a little trickier to keep in. Those yearlings are a little flighty. If you have calves, they like to sneak under those fences. So if those are concerns, that's going to really impact your decision and what you're going to utilize.
Well, Jerry, let's go to you on the same point about infrastructure. How are you handling both the fencing with your rotational grazing program and the water, making sure that they always have water no matter where you're rotating them to?
Well, it is a big issue, and it's been I guess my recommendation to folks watching is don't do it all in 1 year. Take baby steps, or you'll be overwhelmed a bit, and it costs a lot of money. We've got pipeline run all over this ranch, but then once we started winter grazing, that's a whole different system, because our normal pipelines are just under the ground. And so then we live in the Northern Plains, you got to go 8 feet deep. We just put in 2 more lines that are allowing us to spread out a bit. We were making these cows walk a couple miles. That works until, and I learned something, when Mother Nature gets ugly with you, and if you still have those calves on those cows, and sometimes we've played with this, when's the right time to wean, and we could spend a whole hour on that, so I won't get into it. But sometimes those calves won't go to water and they start to dehydrate a bit. I think we've learned a little bit, and having water closer, and so we've run some deep pipelines, which gets somewhat expensive. There are good cost share programs out there. But Miranda mentioned, like in the summer pastures, we've got really good perimeter fence now, just for peace of mind. Times have changed. They're not all rancher folks that live around the world. I'm 25 miles out of Bismarck. 500 cows in somebody's garden, they don't really appreciate it. And so for my peace of mind, or I'd never go anywhere, we've put really good perimeter fence around. But we've run a lot of 2-wire high tensile, and then we run quite a bit of single wire. I really don't like the single wire as well, for the reasons Miranda said. Calves go under, heifers jump over. And once you take high tensile wire and kink it, you might as well throw it in a ball and throw it away, because it's not easy to work with again. So I prefer the 2-wire high tensile. Now on our winter system, we started out trying to use poly wire. One of our goals, if you remember, was to propagate wildlife. We have so many deer on this ranch, they drag that poly wire 2 miles away every night. And when you're dragging that around at 20 below, my quality of life goal was going to heck on me. So we went back to more permanent fencing. Not maybe as ideal, but I would say this to folks: find what works for you, and don't worry about what Jerry Doan or somebody else says, because what works is what's important. And we're grazing these fields in a little bigger sections. It's not perfect, but it's working, and we're using more permanent fences around that. I'm not saying you can't use some poly wire or other types of things, but when you get snow, it's hard to get a decent ground. Even if the cows are broke, and ours are, we still have trouble with them, and especially when wildlife drags them around. So there's lots of issues on it. If anybody has any specific questions, don't hesitate to holler at me, email me, or whatever, and I'll walk through more of those things, because we've got a fair amount of experience on this.
Well, we do have one specific question. We'll just ask you real quick, if you don't mind. How big are your paddocks that you're using for winter grazing?
For winter grazing, well, we may have say 100-acre field, and there may be a cornfield next to it, or a little bit of, alfalfa field or grass or whatever. But there might be 100 acres of cropland in it that's actual cover crop fields. So we might graze that. We might go over here to one that may be 50 acres, or we might have one that's 150 acres. So they're kind of all over. Ideally, I would cut that back into 10 or 20 and move a little more. But again, I found that this really works pretty well. And at some point, then the hardest part is when there's snow and you got a lot of cattle out there and everything, what's half? And, it's under the snow. And at some point, you've just got to say, I think we've taken enough. We better leave something for the soil. That's probably the hardest decision for me, and it will be for anybody trying this. So hopefully that helps them.
Mary, we've got a question for you from the audience, which is really just to explain the composting process. So you're taking manure. How is it transformed in the end, and how is it different in the end than manure? But also, what's the process of getting there?
So composting is a thermophilic decomposition, and so that just means that we are heating and decomposing at the same time. And so what happens and how we do it at the center, so at the Carrington Research Extension Center, we have a compost turner. There are several NRCS and SCDs around the state that have one as well. You don't have to have a turner to make it work. And so you can use your front end loader, your Bobcat, or a pitchfork if you have a few horses. So what happens is we pile that manure up in the spring, and then we start to turn it. And so we turn it every 10 to 14 days. You can use a thermometer like you saw in my video, but most producers are like, if we can just get it on the calendar every 10 days or every 14 days, we know it's going to happen. We remember we have to do it. And so you go out and you turn it. And we turn ours about 5 to 6 times, just depending on what the season is like, what our watering situation is. And so we turn that compost then, or that manure. And after 5 or 6 turns, the microbes have eaten what they need to. They have changed the form of nitrogen that's available from more available to less available. And so that's one of the biggest differences between a raw manure and a compost, is the availability of nitrogen that's in that product. And so I say that the compost is more of a slow release nitrogen product. So the first year you have raw manure, you're going to go out and spread this manure, and you call me and you say, we sampled it, there's 14 pounds of nitrogen per ton of manure. And I'm going to tell you that 7 of that, or 50% of it, is available the first year for crop production. If you call me and say that same thing on a compost, 20% of that is available. And so there's one of the biggest differences is we're trying to change the nitrogen from more available to less available to make it more secure, a more secure product or a more stable product. And in doing that, our phosphorus and our potassium stay essentially the same as far as availability goes. So that is essentially the difference, is we have turned and temped and turned and temped, and we know that the product has changed because of the microbial activity that's in there. So there are a few folks that they'll push up their manure in the spring in their pens, and they leave it, and then they call me and say, we composted our manure, it burned down. And so you will see a burn down with that, but that's stockpiling. And so we have stockpiled because we've only turned it or pushed it up one time. So we want to make sure that if we're actually trying to compost and get that weed seed kill that we're going for and pathogen kill in there, that we're actually turning it several times throughout the year.
How do you know when you've turned it enough, and will that also tell you that you've killed the weed seed that's in there?
So have we turned it enough? I would say, so the biggest thing is, and there are tests for this, you can send this into commercial labs if you want to. The way we check ours is we know that going into this process, the carbon to nitrogen ratio was correct. We know that the moisture levels have been correct throughout the year because we've managed for that. We know that we've turned it and we've temped it. So we know that it's been working because I temp our piles, and so they come up to temp, then they drop back down, and that's our cue to turn. They come back up and drop back down. And so I know that heating process has happened. And after my last turn, I can't get that pile to come back up. It will not, the temperature will not rise anymore. And so when that happens, we know it's done. Do we immediately spread it? No, because the microbes are kind of like starving. They're really wanting something to eat right now. And so if we go and spread it immediately, they're too active, and you're going to get some carbon tie-up out in the field. Whereas if we let them just chill, so we call it curing, we just let them just sit, we push it up in a pile and let it sit till it comes to ambient temperature, so the temperature in the air that's around us. We let it just sit there and cure, and then we can spread it, and it's an awesome product. And what was the second part of your question?
Will that kill the weed seed?
Oh, how do we know if the weed seeds are killed? So something that's simple to do is throw some compost in a planter and see what comes up, water it, and see what happens. So that's a simple way. That's a simple way that folks can know whether they had a good kill or not. Somebody said this earlier. I don't know if it was in our cafe talk or if it was on one of the earlier dirt sessions, but they said, you just got to trust us. Or maybe it was yesterday, Kaylee, you just got to trust the process that it's going to happen. And so there's been a lot of research done showing that after the certain temps, so 130 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit, have been reached a certain amount of times for a certain amount of days, that those weed seeds are killed. But if you want to send it in, you can certainly send it to their commercial labs in the US that will check just to make sure if you're really concerned about that.
Great, thank you so much. Such interesting stuff on the composting. I want to go back to Kevin here. Kevin, we had a question in an earlier panel about, if you've got a crop farmer that's working with a livestock producer and they want to cost share or do some sort of financial arrangement to get livestock on the soil. I'm wondering if you've seen this, if you've worked with producers that are in this situation and what that relationship tends to look like and what seems to be working.
Well, thanks for that question, Tim. And that is a tough question to answer because we really don't know. What we struggle with is the value of that livestock. What do they bring to the crop producer? And so we can fairly figure out what's the value of the forage base for the cattle and what to charge that producer, whatever it is, if it's $1 a day or $1.25 a day. The caveat then is, what is the cattle bringing to the cropland and what is the value to that? If you look at just for lack of fertility, or you add the fertility to the cropping system, you reduce your input costs. That would be an easy one to do, but we still struggle with, depending on your soil type, your environment, you may not see a benefit in terms of fertility levels till years 2 or years 3. And so you don't get a quick number that a producer can use to say, okay, I'm going to save you $30 an acre in fertility. We don't know the answer to that because it just varies so much from year to year. You also get this benefit of the cow being on there, the biologies that she brings to the system. We've shown in data that cow will actually improve aggregate stability versus no cows at all. We also show we can increase infiltration rates with cows versus no cows at all. What is the value to that? And so the project that Miranda talked about, we're trying to get some data on that, but we still struggle today of what can the landowner achieve in terms of a value from the cow. So there's obviously a take for both one of them. We just struggle with what's the value of the cow to the producer in terms of a dollar value. And so I'm not even gonna give you an answer to that because I don't know the answer to that. It's just be kind of guessing right now.
That's right. It sounds like further research is needed into that. But if I can throw another random one at you, is somebody is asking about swath grazing, which I'll admit I don't know what that is. So maybe you could fill us in. What's the plus or minus of this type of grazing program, swath grazing?
So I do love swath grazing. It's an opportunity to harvest a crop, whatever you have. If it's a millet or a perennial, you put it in a row, and it basically keeps that plant, that crop, at that nutritional quality once you harvested it. So you put it in a swath and it allows you to eliminate baling that hay. It also allows you to eliminate transporting that cost of that hay. So all you're doing is putting one cost into it, and that's the swather. And it's a great way to add value to that crop and leave it in a nutritional quality state. I love to actually bale graze put in my swaths at least in North Dakota about mid-September, right before I get to a killing frost. That way I reduce my spoilage from too much rainfall. And I can use that anytime. I can use that in October, November, December, and retain the quality. Even if you get a foot of snow on top of that, those cows will find those swaths. Once they open them up, they do a great job of consuming that. And so it's a great way to reduce costs, keeps the cattle on the land like Jerry talked about. So you keep the manure and urine there, and you get an added benefit from that system without the cost involved in baling it and hauling it home.
Well, we've been having really good luck with just asking a very open-ended question of letting each panelist just kind of take things wherever they want to, because we don't want your content to be limited by our questions. And so, Jerry, maybe we'll throw it to you. And actually, I do have a specific question for you, and then we'll let you just kind of keep it open-ended and go wherever you want. The specific question is, you mentioned in the video that you changed your calving date. Talk to us about that decision and what has been the best benefit other than better weather, or maybe that is the benefit, the better weather.
Sure. Well, we calved traditionally for generations, I guess. We calved our heifers in barns. When I was younger, I thought it was fun getting up all night long and doing that sort of thing. But, like I said, we made that, I don't know, it's close to 20 years ago now. And just trying to, one of our goals is trying to use Mother Nature to our benefit. We usually fight her, cuss her, all those sorts of things. And I sat there and looked at when do the deer fawn? They don't fawn in the middle of the winter. And I started to look at it, and I went to the animal science department head at the time. I'm a graduate at NDSU, and I asked him, give me all the research on later calving, early summer calving. I got a half a page. It hadn't really been talked about or looked at it, unfortunately. And I just said, I've got to do something. We lost 100 calves one year to scours. You're calving in the muck, and you've got issues, and we sent a lot of them to a NDSU vet lab. You got a half a dozen different pathogens killing them, but it's really the underlying issue was the stress on them. And I just said, I either got to do something different or I'm going to quit because this isn't fun anymore. And so I literally had to, it was probably the hardest decision I ever made. I literally had to beat my head against the wall to make it, you know, and we're so traditional in agriculture. It's sometimes hard for us because neighbors are a bit cruel when you do things different. And that's unfortunate, but it's very true. And I know it very well. So now we calve out in the hills in May and June, and it's fun again. Yes, our calves are smaller, but it opens up opportunity to do different things. We have our own branded label. We do sell meat through our website, and we are Audubon certified, one of the few ranches that is. But even if you don't go down that path, I mean, if you're going to sell them off the cow, it's probably not going to work as well. But we take and put those cattle, either sell them to go to grass. The grass market in our area is usually really hot on those light calves, or else put them on grass yourself. And from the profitability standpoint, it has been like this for us. It was one of the, and I said it on the video, I'll say it again, it was the #1 best economic decision we ever made.
Excellent. Well, Jerry, I do want to leave it open-ended for you too. Anything you were hoping to talk about or something that was discussed you want to add on to or emphasize before we start to round out the panel?
Well, I guess the only thing is just telling all the producers out there, like I said, I get it. You know, when I get off speaking across the country on this stuff, young people will come up to me or anybody, you know, how do we get started? Or how do I get dad to allow me to do some of these different ideas? You know, I get that, and being involved in a family operation that's generational myself, I know how hard that is sometimes for all of us. We're very, very traditional, very entrenched. Agriculture, I think, is probably the worst out there, just because, you know, Grandpa did it this way, Dad did it this way, I'll do it that way, and by God, my kids will have to do it that way. And yet, when we went back, and it's part of our holistic management that directs our ranching operation now, our two #1 goals are bring profitability back and improve our quality of life. I think we miss them both in agriculture most of the time. We forget about profitability. We're so used to doing the same thing over and over and over again. And I think that's quite honestly why we struggle getting young people back, because they watch that system and they don't want to be a part of it. Now, there are good young people back, and all three of my boys went off to college across the United States and all came back, and it's exciting. It creates other issues of how do you make that all work, right? You know, and we could spend a whole session on that, but it is exciting. It brought the excitement back to me. And then that quality of life thing, I think it's so important, because I watch too many people do the same thing over and over and expect different results, and they really don't enjoy it. You've got to bring fun back into it again. And, you know, not everything's perfect, contrary to what somebody will think, you know, that I've got it all figured out and everything's perfect here. We have the same issues, the same problems, but we try to have fun again, try to bring the fun back into it, and then bring profitability back. And the good news in all of this is when you're creating soil health again, and then in our case, and we can all do that in some fashion, tell the story, because we've had all these people at this ranch, their perception of agriculture is horrible. And we've done a poor job of telling them that we do good things. Now, I know there's some, you know, there's bad apples everywhere, but we've got to tell them that we are regenerating those natural resources, that, you know, if you believe in climate change or whatever, but we have the answer to help with some of that. It's by sequestering the carbon in our grazing system, in our cover crop systems, and then building soil health back. And then it brings the wildlife back. That's a huge story that we, all of us, need to tell. And it will just help us with less crazy regulations and the public being on our side again as we get more and more removed from agriculture.
Well, Jerry, I can tell you're inspiring people in the audience because we get questions every time you're answering. So, so maybe I know somebody asked about when you wean, and you already told us you could fill an hour on that. But maybe there's some answers you could include in the chat as we continue to round things out and go over to Mary for some final thoughts.
All right. So I would just say I'm going to echo what Jerry has said a couple times and Miranda has said, and I said it initially was, what's your plan? What's your goal? And then what's your quality of life looking like? And so when people tell me they want to graze cattle, they're going to turn their livestock out, they're going to graze them, and they're going to use it for fertilizer management in the winter. And I'm like, oh man, you're going to have to be out there managing those animals. Then we're going to have to, you can't turn 10 cows out on 300 acres and expect to have a fertilized piece of ground the next spring. You're going to have to be out there. You're going to have to fence for that, manage for that. And if that's not your goal, that's okay. You don't have to only put livestock on the land because you want fertilizer value. I am 100% aware that that's probably not always going to happen. But I would also say that what kind of strategies or what kind of management tools do you have to make your goals work? So set your goals, look at your plan, see if it's realistic, and then go from there. And you're not going to be weird if you have to change your plan. We change our plan here all the time.
Thank you so much, Mary. Miranda, for some final thoughts.
The biggest thing is starting small if you're going to get into this, starting where it's feasible for you, and then that scalability, knowing what's going to work for you. And it's part of that planning and goal setting process that everybody's been talking about. But I know a good example is our Sarah project. We have Jerry's one of our producers. He has a large herd, a lot of animals available. So he could easily graze a large pasture at a higher stock density, where we have some of our smaller producers that we're working with have 30 to 50 head of cattle. And so knowing how that fits with what you're putting in the ground. So one of the producers we're working with just finished grazing. He started in early September just because he had a small herd and he had phenomenal biomass production on his 40 acres that we put in. And so maybe for him as a starting point, if he was having all the risk on himself and putting all the infrastructure in himself, maybe starting with 10 acres is a good place to start and seeing how that works and then expanding from there. So really the take home is start with where you're comfortable and with what you can feasibly do.
All right, Miranda, thank you very much. And Kevin.
I want to end by saying this. I think the soil health movement that's occurred over the last decade, and even the dirt workshop that we're enjoying today and yesterday, has clearly shown that cover crops can be a viable tool to improve soil health. I tell producers this all the time. You get into cover crops, it's a great opportunity to improve your soils, but think about this as a long-term program to help your soils. It's not a one-year fix. Think about this in the long term. And so plan for the next 5, 10 years or whatever you're looking at in terms of the life. The Jerry's been doing this for 20 years. And he started at some point, and now we're at the phase where he's seeing these positive returns. Well, he's seen them for a long time now. But think about this as a long-term investment. Don't expect to see dollar savings the first year you do this, and look at it in the long term. I think livestock grazing is a great opportunity to bring an economic return back to that land base, so it can become feasible that first year. And it just becomes a viable option that you can do for a long-term economic return. And remember, livestock add a biology that's new to that system that these soils haven't experienced. So looking at ways to incorporate livestock, whether you have the livestock themselves or you're working collaboratively with a landowner and a livestock producer to bring that, we talked about that question earlier. How do you find a way to incorporate the farmer with the rancher to get that added benefit? There are many farmers who don't want to have a cow in their place, but we can still do this with collaborations with neighbors or with other producers out there. And so just look for this, a long-term impact, a long-term benefit, and where livestock can fit well into your operation.
Thank you, Kevin. Boy, this panel was fantastic. Thank you all so much.